Hundreds of people move to Charleston each and every year to enjoy the sun, the sand, and the water. But there's a downside to this that a lot of people don't consider when they're buying a house in Charleston. That's right, flood zones. We're going to talk about flood zones today. In today's video, I'm going to give you the basic rundown about what a flood zone is, the different types of flood zones that you'll find in and around Charleston, where you can find information about if your home is in a flood zone, and then at the very end, I'll talk about a couple different ways that you can remove your requirement for flood insurance. Pro tip, a lot of these are construction related, and they're pretty extensive, but they're pretty cool as well. So let's get started. Before we can get started talking in depth about flood zones, we need to set up some base vocabulary first. FEMA, which is the Federal Emergency Management Agency, defines a couple different types of floodplain. There's the 1% and the 0.2% floodplains, also known as the 100-year floodplain and the 500-year floodplain. All that 100-year floodplain means is that over the course of 100 years, one of those years will have flooding in that area. Thus, 1 year out of 100 is 1%. By the same token, the 500-year floodplain is very similar, where 1 year out of 500 years will have an area that experiences flooding. So if you take 1 year out of 500 years, that is a 0.2% chance that your property will be flooded that year. Flood insurance requirements are going to vary by county and by your general location, but typically if you're in the 500-year floodplain, your lender or your mortgage lender is not going to require you to have flood insurance. But if you're in that 100-year floodplain, you definitely need to look into getting some flood insurance because it may be federally mandated. Now that we've covered what a flood zone is and the different types of floodplains that we have, I want to talk about the 4 major types of flood zones that you'll find in and around Charleston. The first type of flood zone is one that I personally like, and that is the X flood zone. So this is a part of the county or part of the coastline that does not experience any flooding, or if it does, it's only a very, very small chance. So either 0.2% of flooding in any given year or less. The next most common type of flood zone is called flood zone AE. I think of this one as a little expensive, AE. Flood zone AE is an area that does require flood insurance for your property. This is a flood zone that is characterized as high risk, according to FEMA, and there is a greater risk, so possibly a 1% chance or greater, that your property is going to be covered by water in the course of any given year. The next type of flood zone is called flood zone VE. I like to think of this as flood zone very expensive. A VE flood zone is going to be located right along the coast, and it's going to be an area where there is a much higher chance of there being flooding, so 1% or greater, and that could be influenced by wave action. So all those beautiful beachfront condos and elevated homes on the beach, all of those homes are in flood zone VE, which means that there's going to be water coming under the foundation, which means that there's going to be water coming under the home, possibly driven by the waves of the ocean. The last type of flood zone, you don't see a lot of this, but it's flood zone AO. Flood zone AO is just a local area of low land that has a tendency to have standing water of 1 to 3 feet. For example, on Folly Beach, all the waterfront homes are in flood zone VE, very expensive, but then there's a couple of feet behind the homes along the street that's flood zone AO, and that's just because those streets can often get flooded when there are heavy rains or super high tides. To rank these 4 flood zones in the order of most expensive to least expensive, we have flood zone AO, flood zone VE, flood zone AE, and flood zone X. Now that we've talked about all the different types of flood zones that you'll experience in Charleston, you might be wondering where you can get more information or even find out if your home is in a flood zone. There's a couple different places you can do that. The first place, and probably the easiest one to find, is in the tax records. You would be amazed at what you can find in tax records, but if you go on your county's website, type in your property address, and check out the description there, you can usually find whether or not your home is in a flood zone. The second way to find out if your home is in a flood zone is to go on the FEMA website. If you go on the FEMA website, they have interactive maps that'll show shaded and colored areas where you can see exactly what parts of the landscape are in a flood zone and what parts of the landscape are not in the flood zone. The third place you can find flood information is on the county website, not in the tax section, but in the GIS portion. So that's the Geographical Information System. This is an interactive map that's going to show you property lines, zoning areas, and flood zone types, But honestly, I usually just prefer to go on the FEMA website because the information is coming directly from the source, and I don't have to fiddle around with the GIS system, which depending on the county can be kind of difficult to manage. Before you buy your home, it's definitely a good idea to make sure that you know what flood zone your home is in currently. However, from time to time, usually not more than 5 years apart, usually at an interval not to exceed every 5 years, FEMA will go through and conduct an additional evaluation to make sure that your property is still protected, or is to make sure that your property is still in the proper flood zone. Typically, you'll know if FEMA has issued a revised flood map if you get a letter from your mortgage company saying, hey, by the way, you now need to have a couple $100 a year flood policy to cover your home in the case of insurance. Flood insurance policies are different than typical homeowners insurance policies because most regular homeowner insurance policies do not cover risk or damage from water, whether that is water from rain or water from ground flooding. So keep an eye out for that. If you do get that dreaded letter from your lender saying that you need to get flood insurance, don't worry. There are plenty of carriers who are going to offer you affordable flood insurance to cover your property. Now, it's important to note that you should always shop around for your insurance carriers because sometimes you can save hundreds of dollars a year if you find the right carrier. From my own experience, keep in mind that when you're shopping for flood insurance, there are a few local carriers and usually only one or two large national flood insurance carriers. I actually ended up getting that dreaded letter from my mortgage carrier a couple of years ago that I needed to have flood insurance on my property. What I found out was, interestingly enough, that I got 4 different quotes, but it turns out that 3 of those carriers all just went through the other company to get the flood insurance. So I just ended up going with that company instead and saved myself a couple $100 in insurance commissions. The irritating part about getting that letter, in my case, was that the property that needs flood insurance for me, the entire property is not actually in the flood zone. It's just one tiny corner of the property. As it turns out, even if one tiny corner of your property is in a flood zone, your mortgage lender is going to require that you get flood insurance to cover the entirety of the property. They're just looking to cover themselves in the case of loss. So what are some of the ways that you can avoid having to pay flood insurance? Well, in a lot of cases, you'll see a lot of these homes on the coast are elevated either on pilings or columns. And as it turns out, this is exactly how you can get around having to pay flood insurance. So if you are dead set on not having to pay flood insurance and want to spend probably several tens of thousands of dollars to do so, you can actually get out of the flood insurance requirement by raising your home above the base flood elevation. And there's 4 or 5 different ways that you can do this. The basic gist of elevating a home is the same regardless of the exact method that you use. The idea is that the main living level of the home has to be above the highest water level that can be expected in that flood zone. So if I expect to see 5 feet of water, the base level living area of my home will need to be 6 or 7 feet above the ground so that I have a little bit of clearance above that 5 feet of water. So really quick, for those of you who are interested, I'm going to talk about the 5 different ways that you can elevate a home. The first way is to just extend the foundation. Basically what you do is you put steel beams under the base of the house, jack the house up almost like you would jack up a car, and then raise the walls of the foundation and then put the house back on the foundation. This is going to effectively raise the lowest level of the house up to above the base flood elevation. The second way that you can get your house elevated is to just extend the walls upward. So this works really well with a brick or a cinder block house. All you do is you pop the top on your house, take the roof off, build the walls up farther from where they are, and then reattach the roof. So now you have a house that is slightly higher up from its original location. The third way to get your house elevated is to, and this is directly from the FEMA brochure, so I'm not just making this up, but is to literally abandon the lowest level of your home. So effectively what you do is you raise your home via any of the other methods, and then anything that was on that original level of the home just gets abandoned, meaning it stays there and you're not allowed to have any living space on that lowest level. You can still keep things like a garage, storage closet, things like that, but you're not allowed to have any livable space on that lowest level. The last 2 methods are very similar. The fourth method is to install piers or columns under the house. So again, you're going to put steel beams under the house, you're going to lift the house up, and then you're going to build either concrete or stone or metal columns under the house, and then you set the house back on top. A lot of times you'll see this on coastal homes, which is where the house is raised up on these nice concrete columns, and then you can park your car or your fancy boat toys underneath the house. It's pretty fancy. The last way to elevate your home is very similar to the columns method. In this case, you're going to end up driving pilings into the ground. So instead of elevating the house and then building concrete or brick columns underneath the house. In this case, you're going to raise the house, move it to a different location off-site, and then you're going to drive pilings into the ground, which is going to give you a really steady, solid base. After all those pilings are driven to the ground, then you can move the house from its alternate location back into its original location, this time on top of those pilings. At this point, you should at least feel a little bit more educated on the different types of flood zones there are in Charleston and what you can do to mitigate your flood risk. For most people, the big takeaway from this video, if you're buying a house in Charleston or pretty much in any coastal location, really has to do with what type of flood designation your property has. If you're moving to a coastal area or you're moving to Charleston, the biggest thing you can do is just to check the tax records and the FEMA flood maps to make sure that when you do purchase your house, that you're not buying in a flood zone. So the ones that you want to look for are a property that's in flood zone X, meaning no flood insurance is required, or flood zone AE, which is where flood insurance is required. If you found this video on flood insurance and flood zones helpful, make sure you like and subscribe and check out some of my other videos talking about other nerdy real estate topics to get you up to speed.